Welcome along to this evening's In Conservation With. My name is David Lindo, also known as the Birder, and today my special guest is Caroline Lucas MP, who was the former leader of the Green Party and is the MP for Brighton Pavilion. I'm really delighted to have you here, Caroline.
Thanks so much. It's lovely to see you again. Really good to see you.
Yeah, Caroline and I actually met once before, and that was in December last year. The day before, was it the day off or the day before they announced that there was going to be an election in terms of the Tory party? So our interview, unfortunately, did not actually come to be.
I know, it's a real shame.
Yeah, and what we talked about that day was actually diversity. We actually were speaking about the reasons, or thinking about why the reasons, or what were the reasons, should I say, that ethnic minorities were not so involved in nature. So we thought it'd be a really good idea to actually sort of carry on this discussion today, as well as talk about the future of our involvement with nature, especially given the current COVID-19 pandemic. And before I go any further, I must say that this whole broadcast is being sponsored by Leica Birding and Nature, as well as King's Place Music Foundation, and it's part of their Nature Unwrapped season, so they've actually sponsored it for the whole this year. And I've been told also to say that in October I'll be leading a walk for the King's Place. It's called Walk with the Birder. It's going to be at the King's Place in King's Cross? Yeah, King's Cross, Saturday the 3rd of October, and there'll be details in terms of how you can book onto that. So I need to get all that out of the way first. So Caroline, firstly, how have you spent the lockdown period?
Well, my experience of lockdown has been maybe a bit different, just in the sense that I think all constituency MPs have been pretty overwhelmed by the amount of casework that we've had from people, that there is so much distress and misery and uncertainty out there. You know, people who are potentially losing their jobs, people who are seeing businesses that they've built up begin to disintegrate, people who are desperate to get support from one of the government's financial schemes. And, you know, although I'm sure they were introduced in good faith, a lot of them have quite a lot of loopholes. So self-employed people in particular are not getting the kind of support that they need. So to be honest, it's just been absolutely overwhelming, just in terms of the amount of casework that I think almost all MPs have been experiencing these past few months. And it's given us a real kind of view into just how desperate the situation is for so many people.
So I guess there's no let up. I guess it's going to just get worse, do you think?
Well, I think when the different financial schemes start to be phased out, that's when we'll see, you know, the real level, for example, of unemployment in the country. Right now, it's been masked a little bit through the so-called furlough schemes, where staff have been kept on through government support. But as that gets to be withdrawn, then I'm really worried that we're going to see huge numbers of people unemployed. I'm really worried about our young people in particular, you know, the people who hopefully were just about to sort of set out on the rest of their lives, maybe after studying or whatever. And now everything still kind of feels like it's on hold. So I just think if we don't do something pretty bold and imaginative, things are going to look very grim. But to try to flip that around and to be more optimistic, then maybe we will just find a government that might just step up and do something bold and imaginative and make sure that this is a real turning point. Because, you know, people talk about going back to normal, but I think it's pretty clear that normal was trashing the planet and it was failing the vast majority of people. So, you know, and the famous phrase that so many people are using right now, this is an opportunity to build back better. And if governments have demonstrated that they can spend at scale and at speed when they recognize the level of threat, then maybe, just maybe, they'll recognize the threat from the climate crisis, the nature crisis, and recognize that they do need to listen to scientists after all, that the experts are quite useful, and that the famous magic money tree, you know, was found at the bottom of the garden, the place we always said it was, you know, that austerity was a political choice, and therefore they can make a choice right now to spend money and to do it in a positive way.
Okay, well, we've been through, and we still are going through, a very testing time, all of us. And one of the sort of the nicer things that I think has come from this is the fact that people have become or seemingly become more connected to nature. I think the broader question I want to ask is, as a politician and as a member of the Green Party, how do you think you would capitalize on that? And I think the second question is more of a personal question. Do you think that people will actually keep that sort of love they've suddenly got for nature? Or do you think that once we start running and getting back into situations, and I think, to be honest, you know, given that it's going to be very tough for people coming up, you know, the next few months, years, people may have more of a focus on, you know, their lives in terms of the economy and working. Do you think that people actually will forget what they have experienced now in terms of the nature connection?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, and I guess the jury is out to some extent. I guess part of my response as well would be to say that I do think that the COVID crisis has underlined the huge inequalities in our country. And so people's experience of the last few months is very different if they have a garden, for example, that they've been able to get out into, and if they haven't been on the front line of the health crisis themselves personally or their families. And you're right that for some people, the luckier ones among us, you know, the last few months have been an opportunity to welcome quieter streets and to relish the fact that the birds seem to be singing even more clearly than ever. And it has been very special. And I think there is a real desire to try to hang on to that. But I suppose I just want to kind of make the obvious point that many people haven't had that luxury. And I think things like access to green space has suddenly shown itself to be a real issue of equality, that you know, when, for example, it was suggested that some of the London parks would close because of fears around social distancing, there was such an outcry, because for so many people, access to those parks is absolutely a physical and mental well-being lifeline. And without that, you know, they will really suffer. And so I'm hoping that this recognition about the importance of access to green space, you know, will be something that isn't just for those of us who've been able to be in our gardens and, you know, taking more time to see what's going on in the allotment or whatever, but that it can actually be an issue of equalities, and it can be about saying everybody should have a right to green space. And that, for example, when it comes to planning policy going forward from this, we need to enshrine that in law, that, you know, new planning applications for new homes should only go ahead if there is access to green space within an easy walking distance, let's say. So to try to answer your question, I have high hopes that people will keep hold of this glimpse into a different kind of world that we've seen, and wish to pursue it. And I think there are some signs that might be the case. Just this week, we've had the results, or the interim results at least, of the Citizens' Assembly on climate change. This was 108 people randomly selected from the population, not entirely randomly in the sense that people were selected to be representative of the UK as a whole. So they certainly weren't green by nature. They were genuinely representative of the different views around the environment and climate change in the UK. And I was really struck that the outcome of that Citizens' Assembly was absolutely saying to government, we want you to build back in a greener way. We want you to use this moment to make sure that we do try to enshrine, you know, stronger environmental protections, and that we do learn that from this experience. So hopefully that's a kind of a sign that there is a willingness out there within the public to push this agenda further.
Yeah, you say access to green space, which is obviously so important and was very important during the lockdown in England. I mean, I was in Spain, and I'm still in Spain, sitting in 38 degrees heat now at the moment. And for the first, between March until, you know, May, basically, we had no access to green space at all. We couldn't get out to exercise whatsoever. And if you had a dog or a bike, you could, but that was it. So even kids weren't allowed out for the whole of that period. And it must have been terrible for families there who are so used to living their lives outside, and for kids to be playing outside. It must have been a terrible thing. So I can understand why people in the UK were very up in arms regarding access to green spaces. But when you look at the actual history of green spaces, I mean, parks have been around, I suppose. I mean, apart from the hunting parks of King King Henry VIII and all those people. Parks, as we know it, have been around since maybe the Victorian times, and historically have been for the people in the middle classes, because, you know, the working class people didn't have the time, they were working. Obviously things have changed over the, you know, the decades, and we now have a situation where we have, you know, lots of really interesting inner city parks that people can attend to or go to, and I think there's been a lot of work done in some parts to clean them up since the 70s and 80s. But there's still this issue when it comes to access, because, you know, this kind of goes back into the ethnic minority scenario. There's so few people of colour going into parks, big parks I'm talking about. So for example, I mean, I remember going to Epping Forest, which is obviously a huge area, and within the car park to maybe 100 yards into the park, that's where you saw people of colour, and then thereafter you don't see anyone. And I remember being in Sheffield, and I had a driver who was a Muslim, and I said to him, "Oh, do you ever get to the national park up the road?" He said, "Yeah, but to pick up passengers." And I said, "Well, don't you ever go for a walk?" He said, "What? The way I look with my beard, forget it." And I was quite surprised as to why people felt that they couldn't actually get involved in that.
Yeah.
And I look at my own history and I think to myself, you know, I'm a West Indian by descent, and my parents came here in 1959, 1960. And in those days, it was all about getting a roof over your head, food on the table, and a job. And no one had any time or inclination even to get yourself out into the countryside, because of the way it was portrayed as being the domain of white middle class people, and you would be ostracized and you would be racially abused. And why do that when you can actually spend time playing dominoes and drinking rum in your community? And I think that over the years, things haven't really changed much in terms of people actually getting into these areas or even going out to the countryside. I think the reasons have changed though. I think now it's more about, it's not even a racial thing personally. I think it's more about an inner city thing. It's a socio-demographic thing. I think people just think to themselves, why should I go to an area like that? Why? Because there's nothing there for me. And I just find this whole subject interesting. That's why we were talking about it in December last year. And I was asking you, and one of the questions I was asking you is that, you know, what, you know, as a political party, what would you be trying to do to address something like that?
Yeah. No, I'm really interested in your reflections about why it might be the case. And I'm sure you're right that, you know, in times past, certainly the working classes were just too busy working to be able to spend the leisure time in parks. And that is the kind of history that it's come from. But nowadays, that whole issue of why, for example, the green movement is so overwhelmingly white is something that we absolutely have to address. And I think it's a real problem. I mean, it reflects inequality in our country, but it also shows, I think, that the green movement isn't as effective as it should be, because we're not mobilizing and using the talents and skills of loads of people in society who look at the green movement or look at access to the countryside and just think it's not for them. And, you know, I think your role, if it's not too kind of sycophantic to say so, but I think, you know, the way in which you've demonstrated that people's stereotypes of a birder, for example, being a white middle-class person in rural areas, I mean, you've just challenged that so effectively. And it feels to me that having people like yourself and role models out there who just demonstrate, you know, that this ought to be something that that the green movement ought to be making more effort to reach out into communities of colour, and to make the case, I think, overwhelmingly that social justice and environmental justice are absolutely linked. So this idea that the environmental movement is dealing with issues that are just a middle class concern, I think is so wrong. I can see where it's come from. But when you consider so many environmental issues, they are social justice issues. Something like air pollution, for example. The people who are hit hardest by air pollution are those who can't afford to move away from the busiest, heaviest trafficked streets. And those are the poorest people, and amongst them quite often they are people of colour. And we need to get alongside them as a green movement and be authentic allies with them in a fight that is about, you know, basically access to clean air, which is one of the most fundamental rights that you could imagine. So I think the green movement has got a lot of work to do, both in terms of the people it promotes as spokespeople for the movement, but also in terms of how the environmental issue as an issue is firmly situated within a kind of a rights framework and a social justice framework. And I think we've still got an awful lot more to do to achieve that.
Yeah, I also think, I mean, there's people that point the finger at, you know, NGOs in the conservation world saying, you know, they're institutionally racist, saying that there is a blockage, there's a border, there's a barrier that stops people of color because of racism. And, you know, I couldn't disagree more. I mean, I think, you know, obviously institutional racism exists all over the place. I mean, when I first started my career as the urban birder, when I was born 16 years ago, it was a very painless and pleasurable birth, by the way. I thought that the world was my oyster, and I suddenly realized actually, no, it's not quite the way I thought. And also, for example, I got an agent, and my agent told me, you know, a few months later that he wouldn't have taken me on if I was white. And I said, why is that? And he said, because, you know, you're black, and that's why we're taking you on, because you've got a point of difference. And similarly, when I first got my first TV regular appearance, I was told exactly the same thing. So I was a victim of positive discrimination, which I think is disgusting. Because I think, you know, when people now with the Black Lives Matter and people are now putting out these statements saying we're going to do whatever we're going to do to make sure that we're employing more ethnic minorities and what have you, I'm thinking, well, why haven't you been doing that before? Why have you waited until now to put out messages like that? You should be doing it anyway. And also, conversely, think that people should actually be taken on for, you know, for their merit, and on their merit, should I say, not for what color they are. You know, the police, for example, you know, I know a police woman, a friend of mine, and she was saying that, you know, in some areas they were not recruiting white people because they wanted to get their numbers up, you know, in a racial factor in terms of getting more ethnic minorities involved. And I think that's really wrong. But going back to the nature itself, I just, you know, in my time, I've never or very rarely come across any kind of racism from people within the nature sector. I've always felt, even as a child, living and growing up in a very racist Britain compared to what it is today, that when I got involved in nature, it was like I was amongst friends. I was being looked after. I was being kept in a fold and being, you know, protected. And it was my sanctuary. All that stuff happened, all that horrible stuff happened outside. So when I was at school, in primary school and secondary school, on a practically daily basis, I was called names pertaining to my skin color every day. And I don't know why I did this, but at the age of 8, I kind of got tired of it. I thought to myself, well, I actually said to people, could you not call me something that's actually more to do with me as opposed to a blanket name? And I think that nowadays, as I said before, the main problem, I think, is not so much the racism, it's more the way that the countryside is sold to everyone. It's more the way that nature, should I say, is sold to everyone. You look at the newspapers and the media, most of the time it's a white middle-class, middle-aged man that's presenting it. You know, I find it a bit galling when I watch a program about Africa and I'm seeing, you know, all these wonderful African wildlife, but being presented by a white guy who's got black guys carrying his stuff for him. It kind of doesn't sound right. And I think that there should be more effort made right from that level, i.e. the BBC and all those guys, to actually put people in those positions that other people can then identify with and actually get involved. So that's one element of it. The other element is right at the very beginning when it comes to education. I think that, you know, more education about nature and the environment, please. Because once you start doing that, it makes it much more reasonable for a young kid of any color, creed, or race to think, you know what, I can get involved in this actual industry because it interests me and I want to be part of this. And I think that hasn't really happened at all. So I'm basically trying to say that I know the green movement needs to do some work, but I don't think it's a case that you have to put it upon yourself to say, we need to do this solely, because I think it's a wider picture than this. It's a wider angle. If there's anyone actually in the Zoom room that wants to ask a question or join in the discussion, please feel free, because I think this is a really, for me, it's a very passionate subject, which, as I say, Caroline and I touched on when we met last December.
I was just noticing in the Zoom room a couple of things. Shailesh Patel talking about the young naturalist called Kabir, who's mapped out green spaces in London, and there are some great, particularly young people involved in this area. Maya Rose Craig is another one who does fantastic work. There's a wonderful organisation in Bristol called Green and Black, who are absolutely having, you know, ambassadors from the ethnic minority backgrounds who are going out there, you know, just making it more accessible, I guess, to a wider variety of people. And I think that's important. And someone else in the chat has just referenced the natural history GCSE, which I would love to say a couple of words about, just because I've been working with a wonderful woman, Mary Colwell, who is a writer and broadcaster in Bristol. And it was her idea back in 2011 that there should be a new GCSE in natural history. And so she and I have worked together, and we managed to get a meeting with Michael Gove when he was Education Secretary. And to his credit, he thought it was a good idea and put us in touch with a range of other people. And to cut a long story short, there's a consultation out right now from one of the exam boards, the OCR exam board. And there's a real chance we could get this GCSE in schools, because I think that, you know, for all of our young people to have a better understanding of nature is so important. I was really struck by the words of a US writer, Richard Louv, who wrote that book, Last Child in the Woods. And he basically said that people won't protect what they don't love, and they won't love what they don't know. And that, to me, just absolutely sums it up. And we need to make sure that more people from whatever's backgrounds are able to know this stuff.
Yeah, there's a message here from Cynthia Adu. Can you actually come on, Cynthia?
I can, hello.
Hello. Can
Hi.
you talk about the point you've made, please?
Yes, I am a trainee counsellor. I'm qualifying in November. So I've been training for 4 years, and I'll be a qualified counsellor at the end of the year. And I'm looking to train in walk and talk therapy, so offering therapy outdoors in green spaces. And the nature therapy sector is predominantly quite wide. That could be equine therapy, that could be walk and talk therapy, wilderness therapy, adventure therapy. Aside from a few groups who are looking at that, there is Wild in Nature, led by Beth Collier, doing some great work down in South London here, and the group you mentioned in Bristol as well. But in the nature therapy area, there are a lot of white faces in that space, and I just have a dialogue with myself as to why that is. I do feel like Black people and people of colour have a relationship with the earth, with nature, with the outdoors, but as David mentioned, they're not necessarily feeling welcomed to venture out into their green spaces. And a lot of it, I think, is the marketing and the language that we use. And if you don't see yourself in that space, you don't always feel that space is for you. But I'm looking forward to opening up that idea and letting people know and reminding people that nature is for everybody.
That's fantastic, and well, really good luck, Cynthia, with the studying and the work that you're going to do, because I think it is absolutely such a crucial area of support to people who have, you know, a range of well-being issues, and there's so much evidence now that access to those kinds of therapies is so important. Yeah, I wish you well with it. I think it's good.
Mark Carwardine, my good friend, says, my great heroes of conservation are all people of colour. They run the anti-poaching patrols in Africa and Asia and risk their lives on a daily basis to protect rhinos, tigers and other wildlife. And that is so true. But it'd be great to see more of them in the media spotlight. Yeah. That's the problem. Chris has asked, have you seen an increase in the Green Party membership over the past few months if more people are connecting with nature?
Not a massive one. I would love to be able to tell you that it's just kind of gone through the roof. No, I mean, there may well have been a small one. To be very honest, I'm not sure, but I've certainly not heard that we've seen a massive increase. And I don't know whether the environment NGOs have either. It's just been such a strange sort of few months, hasn't it, with people just kind of reevaluating what's important to them and to their lives. And I'm still hopeful that when it comes to casting people's votes, that they will perhaps cast votes for the Green Party in greater numbers. Although, as everyone will know, one of the issues that we have in this country is our horrible electoral system that is very unfriendly to smaller parties. And you know, about 1 million people voted Green in the 2015 general election, for example, and that still only got us 1 MP. So I would love to see. So I think there's something really important here about how our political system does not enable people's real concerns about a lot of things, but for the moment, talking about the environment doesn't actually allow people's concern about that to be reflected in Parliament. If you compare the UK to so many other European countries where they do have fairer voting systems, they have far more Green MPs elected, and I don't think that's because, you know, they mysteriously care more about the environment in Germany, let's say, or about social justice in Germany than they do here in the UK. I think it is a function of our electoral system, which we still need to change very urgently.
Mark Alton, is it possible for you to switch on yourself and to talk to us? Because I'm interested in your comment.
Yes. Hi. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I just see. I'm just worried that it's going to be sort of business as usual, carry on the same kind of approach. You know, I'm somebody that's very much connected with the natural environment, but I'm also out there on the, you know, I manage nature reserves, so I'm seeing the impact that public pressure could put on it. And I do think that because there's now like a generation of disconnection from the natural environment, people are just not even understanding how to behave, explore or discover, all those things that I definitely did as a child. People just are not even getting that connection. So they're feeling actually, yeah, I'm having a nice time outside, but they're not just not being able to link it together. And that's my concern.
There's something there about trying to inspire people with sort of some of the amazement and awe. I mean, the thing that got me so excited just recently, and I was quite late to discovering this, was all about swifts. I mean, who could imagine that a swift, a bird about that big, could fly 3 million miles in its life? I mean, it just boggles the mind. And if we can find new and interesting ways of getting that information to people, I mean, that's just the one that inspires me. But I was looking actually on something that Maya Rose Craig had been writing. This is the woman who's passionate about increasing diversity in the Green movement. And she was talking about the language that we use, and she was talking about trying to engage some young boys who weren't interested in nature at all. And then she kind of compared a bird with a particular kind of really fast car. And that was the analogy that suddenly got them interested, because suddenly that was a connection that they could make to something that they cared about. So I think it's about, you know, as well as having the GCSE and hopefully making sure that more of this stuff is mainstreamed in our schools and that the whole eco-school movement kind of flourishes and so forth. It is about how we talk about it, and we could be a bit more imaginative about that as well.
It's about storytelling, you know, and I think it's about when you start telling stories, you connect people.
Yeah.
You know, I've noticed that in my life. I remember I was birding in my local patch, Wormwood Scrubs in West London, not the prison, by the way, but in the park. And I remember taking a guy with me, and we were walking back to my car, and there were a bunch of youths sitting on my car. Okay, and my mate was like saying, should we come back later? I said, no. So I went over to them and I said, what are you doing? And I said, we're watching birds. I said, I bet you any money, none of you can watch the swifts flying above our heads. And I explained what the swifts were, that they came from Africa, were in Britain for a couple of months. And I said, I bet you can use my binoculars and you couldn't trace the swift flying around the sky. And I gave him my binoculars, and my mate was like, what are you doing? You know, they can run off with your bins. But they each looked through, and one of them was particularly engaged. I watched him. He was like really giving it that business there. And it was all about telling him a story and getting him to be included, because often these people are not included. They're not spoken to.
Yeah.
You know, they're not spoken to in the language that they understand. There's a young person here, Maya Bambrick, which I want you, Maya, can you come on please? Because she's, you know, what, you're 18, something, Maya?
Maybe 18, yeah.
Hiya.
Your point, it's an interesting point here.
So I was just wondering like how we can encourage young people to engage with nature and also champion environmental issues. I think also like schools need to become more environmentally friendly, which I'm trying to do at my school at the moment by creating like a wildlife garden. And I'm in quite a central town, so yeah, that's what I'm trying to do.
Well done for that. That's really, really important. And it is interesting, isn't it, how a lot of young people now are very engaged in the whole climate movement, and you've got the school strikes and so forth. And yet the other side of that is the nature crisis. And I feel we've done a much less good job explaining about, just as, you know, the climate crisis is an existential threat to us, so frankly is the fact that we are losing so much of our nature and our wildlife. I mean, I think in my lifetime alone, we've lost around about half of the volume of wildlife species in this country. We're just wiping them out. And that is a major problem for the future, because our whole food supply depends on the insects being there and that whole kind of ecological cycle. So as well as being wonderful in their own right, these different parts of nature and the wildlife and so forth, they are vital to our futures and our lives. And somehow we need to kind of reconnect the climate and the nature side of it, I think, so we can get the same people that were, you know, out there championing the school strikes to recognize that it is climate and nature, that we're losing this stuff. And that does start in schools, I think. And so what you're doing in your school, and hopefully what others are doing, I think is the place to start engaging people with all of that. But having role models, having people like yourself and other young people actually, you know, leading the way, I think is the way to get more young people involved. It certainly doesn't work if they get lectured at by older people.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. But I also think that there should be more stuff done within urban areas, because that's where most people live. 81% or 82% of people in the UK live in urban areas. And when you watch the representation of that on TV in terms of nature, it's a very tiny percentage. It's all about, you know, places which are wonderful, but for the average viewer, they kind of think to themselves, oh, that's lovely, but that's over there. I'm here. There's nothing else here. I'm living in my little bubble. There's nothing to do with me. It's nothing to do with me at all. And that needs to be addressed. I think there needs to be a bridge. You know, for example, during the whole lockdown period, you know, there should have been some programming on TV whereby someone goes out with a camera and just shoots from the hip and says, right, I'm walking down the high street here in Leicester. This is what I've seen. This is a herring gull. This herring gull is actually a red-listed bird. It used to live by the coast, and now, you know, since the 1920s. Tell the story. Get people engaged. People then turn around and think to themselves, I have something special outside my front door. And then you start building that bridge to get people involved, you know, just like with the climate change. Get people involved from their doorstep. And that's what's really missing as far as I'm concerned. I think it's really a thing that needs addressing big time. Jim Wright, can I call you up, please? Because you've got a few questions for Caroline. Hi, Jim.
Oh, hello there, David. Yes, well, it's a kind of a political question. The Green Party is very pro-wind power, which is understandable. I just wonder if its approach is not somewhat uncritical and unchallenging. Is she reassured that there isn't damage to wildlife, including migrating songbirds? I mean, she's got this huge wind farm of her own constituency. Does she worry about the impact on marine life?
Well, obviously I do care passionately about marine life, but I also recognise that I guess any kind of infrastructure that we introduce to try to power our homes and to provide the energy that we need is going to have some negative impacts. And so it's a question about how do you mitigate those, and which different initiatives have least damage, because sadly I don't think that, you know, any energy source is impact free. I know, for example, when it comes to the Rampion wind farm, which is the one that you're describing off the coast in Brighton, that there was a lot of work done with people who were advising about the positioning of the wind turbines such that the risk to migratory birds would be reduced to the extent possible. Other people would point out as well that in terms of the marine life around the wind turbine stacks, some people would argue that actually they almost serve as kind of reefs in their own right, and actually that can be quite good for marine animals or certain marine animals around the actual wind farm itself. So, I mean, I recognise that anything that humans do when it comes to interacting with our environment, and certainly something as big as a wind farm or a nuclear power station or anything else, is going to have environmental impacts and impacts on wildlife. Of course I do, but my own judgment would be that when it comes to offshore wind, as long as it can be positioned in the best places possible for it, then that's probably the least worst thing that we could do.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Lizzie Pace, would you mind coming on? Because you've made quite a big point here. Hi, Lizzie. Okay, well, maybe Lizzie might be a bit shy, but she works for a national environmental charity called Trees for Cities. They host quite large-scale tree planting events across London and UK, and feel grateful to have so many ethnic minority groups coming along to join in with planting days. But we're always looking to share the opportunity to get involved with many people. If anyone can advise on messaging to reach people, that would be very welcome. Perhaps I could get in contact with Cynthia to see if she can signpost some of the woodlands where we carry on the therapy. So it would have been nice to have talked about that. Rachel from, Rachel, actually, can you come on, Tor? Rachel?
Hi.
Hi, Rachel.
Hiya. Is that about keeping it wild?
Well, whatever you want to say, actually.
Oh, yeah, well, I was just mentioning that I used to work for London Wildlife Trust. I don't anymore, but they've got a project called Keeping It Wild that's doing really amazing work, working with young people age 11 to 25 and getting them more engaged with wildlife and nature, and specifically targeting people from underrepresented backgrounds, whether that's people of colour or people from lower economic status. And the project is done really well. We've had mentors. So I mentored 3 young people while I was working for London Wildlife Trust as a reserve officer, and 2 of them went on to get their first job in the sector, which was great. But they also do a lot of work with youth groups and schools, and like they work with like youth football groups and get the group to come out on a trip out to a nature reserve and that kind of thing. So those are some positive news from the sector, I guess. That was all I was going to say.
I think that's really helpful, and I think it sort of demonstrates as well that there's a kind of responsibility on us, I think, to go to where underrepresented groups are, rather than just sitting where we are and expecting them to find their way to us. Even if we kind of, like your example with the football, I think is brilliant, because then, if you go along there and make the connection, then I think it's far more likely that people will then return the favour, as it were, and come and see what you're up to.
Yeah, it's a good point, actually, because I've noticed with the London Wildlife Trust and other trusts like the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and the Black Country and Birmingham Wildlife Trust, which, funny enough, many of their areas are urban, and they have quite a mix of different people coming along, which is very promising. Alan McMahon, have you got anything you'd like to say? Because I know that you've written quite a bit here.
Hello, Caroline.
Hiya, how you doing?
Okay, Caroline, yeah. I just wondered, I mean, the Green Party itself has really a smorgasbord of policy positions and all sorts of things. If you look up their website, they comment on very, very many things. And I know that the environmental message can be related to so many things. But I wonder if this is a little bit of the Green Party's problem, because it is really trying to push out messages in so many directions. Would it be better for the Green Party to really focus and make their general message clearer in terms of an environmentalist campaign? I know you can't be a single issue group, otherwise you'd be just a pressure group as opposed to a party. So I do understand that, but I just wonder if there's something in that thought.
Well, it's an interesting thought, and you are right. You know, for years we've been told that we're just a single issue party and go away. You know, that you're not a serious party with policies on all issues. So whatever we do on one level, you could kind of say, you know, you can't win. But what I would say is that I don't think many people vote on one single issue. I mean, all of the evidence that we have is that people, rightly or wrongly, rarely vote on just the environment, let's say. And so part of the issue is that in terms of being able to put a sort of manifesto together for people to vote on, people want to know what you think about education, or they want to know what you think about health. But also, crucially, to be honest, I don't think you can separate the environmental issues away from other issues, and certainly not away from the economy. I always say to people, if you want to judge how green another political party is, don't go to the environmental pages of their manifesto, go to the economy pages, because for as long as we've got an economy that's based on ever more indiscriminate economic growth at all costs, then it doesn't matter what kind of green trimmings you put around the edges of that, you're basically on the road to unsustainability. So at the heart of the Greens manifesto, if you like, is a recognition that we need to have a different kind of economy that puts people's well-being and the planet's well-being at its heart. And if that's your starting point, then that does mean you end up with a whole range of policies recognizing that social justice and environmental justice are linked, and that, for example, you know, if we're going to have an economy that's less dependent on more and more growth, then redistribution of the existing wealth in the country is going to be more important, and therefore that takes you into social policy. So although I kind of see what you're saying in one sense, I think if we were to just simply become the party with only the environment in our manifesto, then that would be tantamount to being a pressure group, and it wouldn't recognise, in fact, that if we're serious about environmental sustainability, it's actually our economic policies that we need to get right first and foremost.
Okay.
That's my answer.
Okay, I know it's your answer. I think my feeling is that if you want to get the environmentalist message out there, that you really do need to narrow down the focus. But it's a personal view, and I understand the point about not wanting to just be a pressure group.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Alan. I think we now can go to Lizzie Pace. Hello, Lizzie. Lizzie.
You said her video's not working, is that right?
Okay. Can you speak, Lizzie? Okay, whilst we're waiting for Lizzie then, there's an interesting angle here from Sasha Barbato. Sasha, can you come on? Can you talk about this travel thing you were talking about?
Hello, David. Hello, Caroline. It's fascinating listening to you. Thank you for everything you've said so far. I work in travel, and I'm also passionate about wildlife and the environment. And I know some people find it difficult it can be a bit of a contradiction between the two. How does the Green Party plan to balance climate change with the future of travel? Because I personally think travel is very important for bridging communities, as David was saying, and for getting people involved around the world, bringing money to local communities as well as to the UK. And I'm just wondering how the Green Party plans to balance the two out.
Well, it's a very good question. And I guess you're speaking primarily about aviation. And as we know, aviation is one of the fastest growing sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And certainly if aviation was allowed to be unconstrained, then basically there will be very little space for any other part of the economy to have emissions, because basically the carbon budget that we've got left would be taken up almost entirely by aviation. So I think our starting point is that we need to stop the growth of aviation, and we need to stabilize it at a more sustainable level. And the way that we would suggest doing that would be through something that you've probably come across called a frequent flyer levy. In other words, we wouldn't stop people making we couldn't stop it at all, but we wouldn't change the price signals for the first flight that someone might take in a year. But as soon as you take more than one, then it would begin to ratchet up the cost of the air ticket until it becomes pretty prohibitive. But it would be a way of kind of sharing that kind of so-called carbon budget more equally between people, because it would mean that, you know, those people who perhaps are flying most regularly to second homes or whatever would probably have to think again a little bit, and perhaps that would be much less economic for them to do that. But at least it means that someone else who's kind of saved up for their family holiday and desperately wants to do that and is not flying every other month of the year is still able to do that. So I think it's about trying to find a fair way of sharing out the available carbon budget that is linked to aviation, if I can put it that way. I mean, I think whatever way we do it, it has to be about, it has to have equity at its heart. but having said that, I think it's really clear that things like, you know, building extra runways at Heathrow or Gatwick is just simply the wrong way forward. I think we have too much aviation at the minute in terms of the climate impact that it has. And so we need to start restraining that and constraining it so that it fits within the kind of ecological limits that we have.
Yeah, that's interesting. There are many airlines working towards cleaner fuels. Do you think that is just too far off in the future? Do you think they're not going to get that in place quick enough to have an effect, or is that also a possibility?
I mean, I would love there to be a miracle fuel that would allow us still to go on flying, because you were right with what you said earlier on. It is an amazing thing to be able to do, and the cultural and social benefits from it are can be massive. But I think when it comes to alternative fuels, if it's a biofuel you're talking about, then that has a whole set of other problems associated with it, in the sense that if you were giving over huge amounts of land that could otherwise be growing food instead to growing crops for travel and for fuel, then that is likely to exacerbate issues of hunger in the world. So I think that's probably a non-starter. And also, for as long as you know, the aviation industry talks about the efficiency gains that it's going to make and the fact that their engines are more technologically efficient than they were, and I'm sure that's true, but the point is that the overall growth of the aviation industry is far outstripping the efficiency gains of each individual flight, if you like. And so for as long as that's still so far out of kilter, and so that all of those efficiency gains are offset by the growth in the number of flights being taken, then that still doesn't add up to anything that looks like a sustainable way forward, I don't think.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. Do you not think, Caroline, that the aviation industry is going to be changed now for some time, given what's happened?
I mean, it's certainly the case that fewer people are likely to be flying in the short term. And we know that companies like British Airways have used this moment to, I think, quite immorally, you know, sack loads of people, 12,000 people, I think the figure was, in terms of what they're doing. And what we want to see is this kind of so-called just transition. In other words, if there are jobs in industries like aviation that are less likely to be sustainable in a greener future, then it is our responsibility to ensure that there is a right to retrain, that there are income guarantees, that we support those workers in that transition. Because simply throwing loads of people out of work in high carbon industries, you know, just as in decades gone by, the coal miners were just left, you know, once their industries have been closed down. Those communities are still struggling to recover from that decades later. So I think it's incredibly important that we do have a properly considered process with the unions involved, as well as government, as well as business, to make sure that we have this retraining and support and income guarantees and so forth, to enable people to be able to make a shift to the very many jobs that there will be in a green economy. There are far more jobs in a green economy than there are in a fossil fuel economy. But the crucial thing is how you make that transition and how you do it in a way that doesn't leave people left out and without support.
Okay, CGA, in fact, we've got maybe, 9 minutes, 8 minutes left now. So CGA, can you give us a quick question, please?
Yes, hello.
Hi, CGA.
Hello. My name's Colin, not CGA, by the way. I noticed, Caroline, a few moments ago, you touched on the economy. Was you indicating towards the donut economy? And if so, how could that be introduced?
Well, thank you for your question. And the phrase donut economy, as I'm sure many of you know, came from a book by Kate Rayworth, who is an economist. And she described the donut economy as a way of trying to talk about the kind of sweet spot of where we should try to keep emissions such that there's enough production and consumption going on to ensure that the poorest people, both in this country and in other countries, have enough, but not so much that we then, with the outer ring of the donut, if you like, that we start exceeding limits when it comes to air pollution, marine pollution, climate change, and so forth. And I think that idea of trying to keep the size of the economy and the nature of the economy within sustainable limits is a helpful one, and that the idea of this donut was quite a clever physical way of representing this sense that we've got to make sure that those who don't have enough get enough in a green future, but we also need to pull back those people who are over consuming, or those areas of the economy that are taking up too much space. And in terms of how you do it, I mean, I think just as in the climate change debate, people have become familiar now with this idea of having a carbon budget. In other words, you calculate how many emissions, how many parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere is safe, and then you work out how you allocate that on a fair basis. I think we're going to need to start to do that with other kinds of pollution or emissions and so forth, and try and get a sense of what fair budgets look like when it comes to trying to keep all of us within that safe space.
Okay, thanks, Colin. Julia Fraser, you got a quick question? Julia? Because I think her hand was up for a question. Okay, and I think there's another question that I just saw a minute ago, but I think Claire Evans has got a question.
Hello, yes, I did have a quick question on, with all this sort of emphasis on nature and we're being much more aware of it and the environmental impact, how much power do you think that we as the public are going to have to be able to either push forward environmental developments, or in particular the greening of urban spaces with the new developments that are going ahead?
It's a really good question, and it feels like there are sort of several different ways of trying to answer it. I mean, a lot of those decisions that you're describing may well be happening at local level, and therefore local authorities are going to be really important. And yet local authorities have quite a lot of their powers taken away from them. And so it becomes harder to actually lobby your local authority about a local issue, because if you're not careful, it's been decided at a national level. So I would like to see decisions taken in a way that people can influence them at local authority level where possible. In terms of the wider kind of pressure that individuals can bring on government, I mean, I think I would always say never underestimate the difference that you can make. And I think, for example, turning back to the climate question just for a second, I think that the school climate strikes, Extinction Rebellion and so forth, I think they were absolutely instrumental in Parliament deciding, for example, to declare a climate emergency. The important thing now, of course, is to make sure that we actually see action. It's easy enough to declare an emergency or to declare that you care about something, and what we need now is real action. And, you know, I would encourage you to get involved in, you know, the different kinds of NGO campaigns, 38 Degrees and others that are putting pressure on MPs. Make sure you talk to your own MP, because it does make a difference. But, you know, I think it may well take more civil disobedience, frankly, to get the kind of action that we need fast enough. Because one thing that maybe I would say, just as a kind of way of beginning to wrap up as well, is that the issue with all of the things we've discussed tonight is that they're not only kind of important, but they have a time limit on them, in the sense that if we don't get ourselves off the collision course we're on with climate catastrophe very quickly, then it will be too late. And if we do have a recovery after COVID that locks in a high carbon trajectory, then we will have squandered, you know, the most important moment that we have right now to try to get ourselves off that collision course. And so one of the things that I spend my time really trying to think about is, how do we garner the political will to make the right thing happen? Because we already know that greener action makes economic sense. We've had reports just from a number of different think tanks over the past few weeks talking about how a green recovery is far more cost effective than a fossil fuel recovery, that there's a much higher return on investment, that it makes economic sense. We've seen with the climate change, climate assembly, the citizens assembly, that the public are happy to go in this direction. They want to go in this direction. And yet we're likely to see a report launched tomorrow morning from the Climate Change Committee, which advises government, saying again that the government isn't doing nearly enough. And so the question that I kind of go to bed thinking about each night is, you know, how do we garner that political will? How do we put pressure on our politicians to act while there's still time? And that does seem to me to be the overwhelming question. And I think we should do all the things that we can in terms of the traditional lobbying that people do, and writing to their MPs and so forth. But I do also think that peaceful civil disobedience might well need to be part of the mix as well, if we're to get off this collision course fast enough.
Well, Caroline, it's been really fascinating having this discussion, which we could carry on all night, I can definitely guarantee. How do you enjoy nature, by the way, yourself? What do you do when you're sort of winding down and not talking politics?
Well, I'm blessed to live in Brighton because we've got both the beaches and the downs, and so walking on the downs with our rescue dog Harry is one of my favourite ways to try to wind down a bit. And then going back to my new obsession with swifts, we've got the swift box on the house, and I've been playing the swift calls that are supposed to lure the swifts into the swift box, and it hasn't happened yet, but I won't give up because I think swifts are amazing.
You should have been watching last night. We had Edward Mayer, and he was talking about swift conservation, and it'll be actually on this site maybe tomorrow, so you can watch it.
I was looking to find that today, thinking, where is it? Because I missed it last night, but it's great to be on the site.
It'll be on tomorrow.
Cool.
Caroline, sorry?
I was just going to say thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate it, and thank you for all of your amazing work because it's really inspirational.
Well, the feeling's mutual. Thank you so much for sparing your time. Zoomers, what I might do, we might sort of carry on for 15 minutes after Caroline's gone, just have a discussion to get things off your chest if you fancy it. But I'd like to thank you, Caroline, on behalf of everyone for being here tonight on In Conservation With. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. And very sorry I can't stay. Take care.
No problem. Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks a lot.